Hello, everyone. I hope you are all doing well today. I'm Elizabeth Corey, and I'm the founder of beatingtrauma.com. And today we're gonna talk about another trauma topic. I know that today's a big day in the United States, and that there are lots of other people who are watching what's happening here in the U.S. as well. And I think it's bringing up a lot of fear for a lot of people. And part of that is because of our past traumas and the meanings that we are attaching to what's going on today. And part of that is real. So, and that's sort of what I want to talk today about a little bit is kind of figuring out what goes on in our system when we are dealing with fear in particular, because it can be quite the puzzle to figure out what our fears are actually about, which, by the way, is rarely what we are spinning about in our minds most of the time. But it's about something like deeper. It's about a pattern that is being represented by the thing that is currently spinning in our minds, right? So I want to say hi to Rebecca and Carol. Thank you guys for being here. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what fear does in the body, how it gets used against us a lot of the time. And so just kind of dissect fear a little bit. I can tell my voice is going to cause me some issues today, so hold on for that. So sorry. Sometimes this is how it is. But hi to Trish. Glad you're here too. So look, here's the thing about fear, and this is true for all emotions in general, that fear is supposed to exist in the human system. Like, it's supposed to be there. It's a part of the body. It's a very important part when you look at it from a standpoint of human evolution and how we are supposed to live on the planet. Fear is something that is used to keep us alive, right? I mean, it is supposed to invoke the nervous system, invoke this automated response when we are in danger. And I'm sure you guys have all done your research and you already know this. I'm not telling you something new. But, what the fear does in those moments when we have those sort of hormones that flood the system, we move into this automatic response. We turn off like 90% of the frontal lobe functioning because there's no time to think in these kinds of situations. We need to act very quickly, right? We need to act very impulsively to avoid a particular danger. Also, we will see that even like things like our physical strength will increase momentarily to get us through something that's particularly dangerous. This is natural. It's supposed to be that way. That's not broken. That's what's supposed to happen for us, right? And so that's the natural process. Again, I'm sure most of you know that. And it's true of all emotions in our system. And for those of you who've been listening for a while, you know there are 5 primary emotions I speak of. These are 5 primary traumatic emotions. I have made that list small because I feel like sometimes we can look at feelings wheels and freak out because there's so many options on them. So I work with 5, and those 5 are going to be anger, futility, fear, grief, and shame. Those are the ones I focus on. In addition to that, we can have all those feelings on that wheel, but usually they stem from one of those 5 traumatic emotions. And then, of course, we do have non-traumatic emotions that show up usually as we heal ourselves. For example, joy, right? Like, we do have those. But I focus on those 5 mostly in our work because as we do trauma work, that's really what we're kind of dealing with is those 5. So today I'm going to talk about fear, but all 5 of those emotions live in the system of every human being on the planet that I've got. I had a little blip there, so hopefully you guys can still hear me. But if somebody comes to me and says, I don't have one of those emotions, I'm going to say, maybe you're just not quite connecting to that emotion at this time. And that's okay, because a lot of us aren't connecting to all of our emotions in the body. We are blocked. which happens. And so that's one of the reasons why we do this work, is to try to unblock ourselves from some of those harder emotions to feel for us. And everybody's a little bit different as far as what emotions they can feel more easily than others. And so that's also something important to understand. But today I want to talk a little bit about fear. I do want to say hi to Katie and Jan. So glad you guys are here. Beatrix is saying, what do you say when a close friend says DID doesn't exist? Well, I don't know that I would say much. And the reason I wouldn't say much is because it is not my job to explain to that person that DID does exist. It is not my job to educate them on DID. I mean, I might say something like, well, I think you're wrong and you need to do some research. You could leave it at that. But what I have found is people that are willing to deny the existence of dissociation in any of its forms are generally projecting their own denial on what's going on in their systems. So they don't want to face the dissociation that they have in their system, so they're not going to be able to validate it in you. Typically, I will take a step back from people who can't validate whatever it is, my trauma story, my emotions, the resulting dissociation that comes from that. I'll take a step back from those people. I might still interact with them, but I probably won't be as willing to share unless those people are showing a significant interest in becoming, more educated about what goes on when somebody experiences complex trauma. So, look, I have plenty of people in my life who I don't talk to about this journey. Believe it or not, there are people in my life that I don't. Because I don't feel like they're really going to come back with something that's good for my system. And that's okay. The key is that you validate yourself, that you have some places you can go, like here, for example, to validate your experiences. But yeah, not everybody is going to come to the table in the way you need. And for those people, it may be that we need to take a step back. Do not spend a ton of time trying to convince this person that DID exists, because that can be so re-traumatizing when they don't believe us, right? So now we're playing in that same pattern we were with our family of origin. We do not want to be doing that. So take a step back for that person and share with people that are safe, right? Like, that's been my motto all along. And it's an important one. And it's one of the reasons I created this community, because we need lots more people who can validate our experiences. I'll even go as far as to say that I was told, when I started to question whether or not I had DID, I was told by a therapist that I was too well functioning to have it. And I will, because, the whole M. Night Shyamalan version of DID, right? And so I actually had to stop seeing her. And this was after 7 years, and that was heartbreaking for me and my system. But it was the right call for me at the time, because I needed to be very validating of myself and my dissociative trauma responses. So, yeah, that's what I have to say on that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about fear. So when we talked earlier about, if we experience fear when we are going through an acute, dangerous experience, that is a normal process that happens in the body, and it is supposed to happen. It is a good thing, right? But what happens when we experience complex trauma, right? This fear state never actually goes away. And we already know about a lot of the physical symptoms that happen when the fear state doesn't go away, right? Like the body's constantly flooded with these hormones, the cortisol, all of those things cause us lots and lots and lots of physical issues that most of which are things we now take to doctors, and doctors say, I don't know how to fix that or what's wrong. Okay, so that is the physical side. But the problem with the fear state happens when the brain starts to get involved, okay? Because now we're no longer sitting with the fear that comes from the traumatic experiences. Now we're in what I call a fear cycle. And the fear cycle was never actually meant to be there, okay? And unfortunately, many perpetrators know this and will use it against us. And we see this with people who want to be in control, who want to be in power, and they will say that the goal is to keep people in their fear, right? Because if they keep people in their fear, then those people are more susceptible to suggestions. They're desperately searching for someone to save them. They're going to struggle to overcome circumstances that keep them sort of in a position of being victimized by others. It keeps the people in power. And so a lot of times people, whoever those people are, whether it's our family of origin or people in society who have power, want us in this fear cycle, right? It's one of the reasons there is news. And it's a lot of the reasons why that news is so focused on fear, because that keeps us tuning in, right? And all of that comes into this frontal lobe and feeds this fear cycle that's in us. So the original fears from our original traumas are there, but then there's so much more going on because this cycle that's happening, like the brain starts to take that fear and starts to make it about today, okay? And don't get me wrong, there are plenty of things to be afraid of today. But the problem is that all the fear from everything that's ever happened to us is now being pushed into this experience about today. And so the brain is fueling the body's fear, and the body's fear is fueling the brain. And now we can't sleep because we're spending the entire night spinning around what's going to go wrong next, right? Our goal is to step out of the fear cycle, but we can't ignore the fear to step out of the fear cycle. By the way, a lot of people will say things like that. Ignore the fear. Tell it it's wrong. Pretend it's not there. Say something over top of it that's more positive. I mean, we hear these things all the time. But the truth is, none of that's going to work. We have to hear the fear. We have to sit with the fear, but not hearing the fear that's in the frontal lobe. We have to work on stopping that cycle by stopping the brain's version of the trauma story, of the fear story, and get into the body and listen to what the fear in the body has to tell us. Now, and you may be wondering, what is the fear of the body telling me? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Actually, in just a few minutes, I'm going to give you some ideas of the kinds of things that might actually be going on with that fear. So this is where we need to know what about the fear, what are the stories that perpetuate the fear, right? We need to get to know parts like our defenders and their contribution to the fear cycle. It's very, very important for us to understand how the defenders are playing into the fear cycle. Most of us think that our fear is coming from our inner part, our little inner parts, like our inner children, and that it's coming from the original traumatic experiences. But the truth actually is that a lot of the fear is actually coming from our defenders directly. Older parts. Hopefully you can still hear me. But these are often older parts in our system. They're still children. They're still young. They're not adults. But they actually hold a lot of the fear that's in our system. But they don't really want you to know that. So they spin your mind with all this fear up here, right? So the majority of our fear, again, is not about the original traumatic experiences. It's about the process of uncovering and believing and emotionally processing the original traumatic stories. This fear is really huge in our system, and it's huge for several really important reasons. And this is where some of our best fear writing can come from. Not from what the frontal lobe is telling us all of our fear is about, which is usually something present day, but about the actual process of, like healing our traumatic experiences. And so I'm going to talk about a few themes that might be going on with your fear can help, if you're writing from these things, to take you out of that brain fear, out of that spin cycle, as I call it, out of that current moment trauma, fear, and bring you back into some of the original fears that are sitting in the body and are driving a lot of what is happening in our system. And I'm going to talk about 4 examples of that today. But before I do, I'm just going to answer Shabnam's question. Could the same be for grief too? I.e., all the grief from the past comes from the current grief, i.e., somewhat a grief cycle. Yes, to some degree, this is true of all emotions in the system, that we will often find that something that's happening now is triggering that particular emotion. But it's not the start of that emotion, right? So there is deeper issues around things that have happened in our past that's actually driving the emotion. It's why sometimes when we feel an emotion now, it feels so intense, and maybe even in some cases more intense than it should for the experience we're having. That's not always true, but it can be. It's because there's so much more emotion coming from what I call a pattern or a thread of experiences that have been going on for a really, really long time. They're all fueling that particular emotion. Definitely happens when we're grieving. You know, like an example, like losing a pet or losing a friendship. And when you're grieving that loss, you may also be experiencing feelings about all of the previous losses you've had, all the previous times you've been abandoned or rejected, or people have passed away, or whatever it may be. It kind of, the grief that's coming up can have this sort of thread of experiences tied to it. No, it doesn't mean that if you start, your controller will tell you this, so I'm just going to say, it doesn't mean that if you start grieving, you have to grieve every ounce of grief you have in your system. That's not true. That's the controller talking. It will come to you as it can and as it needs to. But yes, we are going to see that most of our emotions are fueled by lots and lots of experiences from the past, and that we are, in fact, through these emotions, they're being triggered by patterns and themes. And I'm going to talk about a few of those patterns and themes now. So when we have a lot of fear coming up in our system, I'm going to go over 4 patterns. By the way, there aren't just 4 patterns, but these are 4 patterns that I see in my own processing a lot of the time. The first one is fear of punishment. Now, you may be thinking, well, that doesn't have anything to do with now. Well, not exactly, but sometimes the fear of punishment will get triggered because we are maybe doing some recovery work that's off limits, or we are experiencing some retaliation from someone, maybe in our work environment or in our family of origin, that is bringing up this fear of punishment. And this can show up in a lot of ways, especially as we step out of our comfort zone and we start doing things that feel really scary to us. When we start, for example, remembering or seeing the truth about our life, or talking about people who maybe were abusive to us and controlling to us in our childhoods, we will have a tendency to feel the fear of punishment. Again, this is a defender fear. This is not coming from the original traumas, but it's coming from the people in our past who threatened us. For example, don't try to get too big. Don't try to do too many amazing things or have an amazing life. Don't remember what's happened to you. Don't see the truth. Don't speak poorly about those who have hurt you. These often show up as contracts. Let's see. Okay. Sorry, today we are having a really choppy connection and I keep getting these little cuts off. So hopefully everything's still okay. But, these kind of fears, a lot of the fear we feel in our system, when we start to feel that somebody's going to get us, or somebody's going to punish us, or somebody's going to retaliate against us, or if we speak up, something bad is going to happen. These are the fears of punishment, and they are often tied to many, many, many experiences and threats that have happened over the course of our lifetime. Again, not necessarily based on the original traumas, but based on the fact that we were threatened not to do anything about those original traumas. I mean, not even to remember those original traumas in many cases. So a lot of fear is associated with that. The second fear I want to talk about is the fear of emotions. Okay, so we are going to have controller fear of emotions. I've never met a person who doesn't have the controller fear of emotions. It's just going to be there. And part of that is because when we were children, we could not process those emotions, right? As children, we didn't have the capacity to let ourselves, one, because we probably still weren't in a safe place, but also because the child's brain, like we don't have the adult self yet, we're just not able to hold space for those emotions. So the controller still believes that this is still true. And if we go to those emotions are going to destroy us. Sort of coming back to that thing I mentioned a minute ago about the controller saying, if you let the grief in, all the grief will come in and you will like not survive it, basically, is what they think. So oftentimes the controller will come in with a lot of fear around the emotions itself. And in the process of having that fear, they will block a lot of fear. They'll block a lot of emotions. It can be fear, but they'll block it with their fear. And it puts us in this place where we're really stuck because of the fear of the emotions and of the recovery process itself. This is some of the most intense fear in the system. Okay. The third one I want to talk about is big. It is the fear of not belonging, the fear of rejection and abandonment. And yes, this fear can be tied to original traumas, but a lot of times we are told that if we acknowledge the trauma that's happening, if we keep telling the story of what we're really experiencing, that we will actually be rejected by the people who are traumatizing us, for sure. But we will be rejected, we will be outcasted, we will be abandoned by the exact people who are doing the horrible things to us. So the only way we can keep the people around that need to be around for us to survive as children, right, is to pretend everything's fine. So there can be a really, really intense fear around this idea of rejection and abandonment. And it can be triggered by things happening today. And that's how we get into that fear cycle again, where the fear cycle is somebody's going to reject or abandon me today, right? I'm not going to belong today. And then it drops into that whole thread of experiences, building the fear that's in the body, which then comes up and gets fueled by the fear in the brain. And then it goes around again. And it's this endless fear cycle that we can wind up in, right? So that is a huge fear that is often driving us and driving our what actions we will take in our current life. So we need to be aware of that fear as well. And by the way, as I talk about these fears, every one of these fears is an excellent writing prompt. And the reason is because we start to get to the patterns that are underneath whatever that fear of today is telling us, right? Because very often the fear of today is the tip of the iceberg. It's the trigger, but it's not actually where all that fear sitting in the system originally started. And that's important to know. Now, the last one here that I want to talk about today is the fear of patterns repeating themselves. Okay? And this one can be fueled a lot by the spiritual world that we live in around us, which sometimes will say things like don't pay attention to what you don't want in your life. Like you know, if you give attention to something, you give it power, you give it fuel, you give it, you know, you manifest it, right? Like these are some of the messages we hear around us today that come from sort of these more spiritual, unfortunately a little bit bypassy kinds of, you know, ideas around healing. But in general, the controller does believe, and probably has always believed, even without that spiritual stuff, that if we give attention to the bad things, if we remember the bad things, if we try to process the emotions from the bad things, that's going to make them repeat. Ironically, it's exactly the opposite. In general, if we keep all that stuff stored in the unconscious, if we keep all that stuff stored away where we can't see it, with this frontal lobe part of the brain, we can't see it, we can't process it, we can't figure it out, then actually it is at its strongest level of manifestation in our lives when it is there. When we are not looking at it, it is much more likely to smack us upside the face in our lives by repeating patterns. And this is why I cannot stress enough how important it is to pull all out of the unconscious. We want to pull it all out. We don't want to leave anything in there. Now, of course, I don't know if that's totally possible in one human lifetime, but I'm just saying the goal is to get as much of that stuff out as we can, right? So that's ultimately what we are trying to do here. So these are 4 really powerful fear patterns that we want to try to do some writing from that keep us from getting to the stuff that heals us, that really changes things for us, changes our patterns, changes the amount of fear in our system. So I really, really want to push for you to spend some time with that. Carol is saying, and the irony is seeing that the actual grief behind the huge defended fear is not nearly as bad as we thought. Oh my gosh, I know, Carol. I know. I don't know how many times I have tortured myself, literally tortured myself to try to avoid an emotion. And then I let the emotion through. After escalating, like all the fear and the grief is escalating in the system for days and days. We feel horrible, absolutely horrible. And then we actually feel it and we're like, oh, okay, like that wasn't nearly what I thought it was going to be, right? So yes, that is super true. Trisha's saying, my brain is just not taking any of this in. I understand. Really struggling with dissociation and funnily enough, also very fearful these days. Yes, there is a reason I picked this topic for today. Like it's, and you guys know, I always pick topics based on what's going on in my own life, personally, and the stuff that I'm dealing with. But I also picked this topic today because it is so prevalent, especially for people in the U.S. today. So I really wanted to hit this because I'm like, if you're having a ton of fear, spend some time looking at what are the patterns underneath the fear. What is the pattern this is coming from? Because it's going to be there. But yes, dissociation will make it hard for you to take in what I'm saying. A lot of people struggle to take in what I'm saying because their controllers do not want them to take it in, and that's normal. It's okay to come back and listen to this as many times as you need to listen to it to get the idea that you need to get from it. And I'll be honest, sometimes if you get these messages like at different points in their recovery, you're going to take different things from them. So yes, Carol, I think you're right. The world is watching today. I've talked with a lot of people from a lot of places, and everybody's on edge. I get it. Jan is saying, such great archaeological digging of our defenses, a great explanation of fear patterns as obstacles to healing. Yeah. So the next time you're feeling fear and your defenders want to tell you, oh, that's just about this thing happening in your current life, or that's just an inner child feeling that fear, and we don't need to pay any attention to them. Take a second, take a step back and go, is that actually what's going on? Or am I having some defender fear because I don't want to see something, or I don't want to feel something, or I don't want to go somewhere that is feeling scary to those defenders? Because I'll be honest, most anxiety, okay, like real anxiety and panic, is actually coming from that place, not from the original traumas, or even totally from something that's triggering it today. That may be part of it, but it's usually just a part of it. So thank you all so much for being here with me today. I know I've got a little over, but I started late. I'm just on one of those places right now where timing is not working out. But thank you guys so much for all your contributions, for being here today. And hold on. We're gonna be on a little bit of a wild ride here, I think. And yes, it will impact people who are not necessarily in the U.S. as well. So I look forward to seeing you guys next Tuesday, and hopefully maybe a little brighter and a little less fearful. We'll see. All right. I will talk to you guys then. Thanks. Bye.